Thanks for being here, everybody. We're going to step outside the box a little bit and talk about work that we've been doing on shrubland birds in the Northeast, and hopefully this will have some relevance, I think, for managing shrubland animals in the Pacific Northwest. So it's always great for me. I'm kind of a Westerner at heart, and as an ecologist, it's nice to come west, especially since most of the Northeast tends to look something like this, at least in the popular imagination. But if you really want to stereotype about the Northeast, a better stereotype is that it looks all like this. There's been a great success story in the restoration of forest cover in the Northeast after it had declined during settlement, and the return of forests is a marvelous success story, but at the same time, that forest recovery has come at the expense of a lot of early successional habitat. And the Northeast, contrary to what people might think about it, actually has a great diversity of early successional habitats and early successional plants and animals. And we focus on the shrublands, and there are a variety of different shrubland habitats in this region. They can be either anthropogenic or man-made or natural. On the left, you can see a power line right-of-way and a regenerating clear-cut, which are anthropogenic habitats. And on the right, you've got an old field and a beaver meadow. And these are all different shrubland habitats that support a variety of plants and animals. The bird community in northeastern shrublands is especially diverse. By our reckoning, there's at least 41 species of birds that breed in shrublands in the northeastern U.S. And if you look to the entire east, it's probably easily double that number. So this is a really big, diverse bird community, and it's important to think about its conservation. Now, historically, these birds and their habitats would have been maintained by natural processes like fires and floods and grazing or browsing by these guys. But nowadays, we don't have mastodons around, and we don't have much fire or flooding anymore. And that means we're left to human activities to manage shrublands. And so most of the shrublands that exist in the Northeast now exist because of human activities. And in an ideal world, we'd have enough of this sort of activity going on that we wouldn't really have to worry about the specifics of how we manage shrublands from place to place. But unfortunately, there's not enough habitat. If you look at trends in habitat availability in the Northeast, there's a long-term decline. This is data from the Forest Inventory and Analysis Project. And in just the last 50 years, Massachusetts has seen a 90% decrease in the amount of early successional habitat. And you can find similar trends for other states in the Northeast where there's not a lot of logging going on anymore. And as a result of this, of course, populations of shrubland animals are declining. So here's 6 common species of shrubland birds, or formerly common, I should say, because a lot of their populations are reaching critical lows now. And I could have easily substituted in an additional 20 or 30 species here that are also showing the same kinds of trends. So this is really the motivation for our work. We want to understand why these birds are declining and help managers to be able to produce habitat for them. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. We're going to be looking at the sorts of ways that shrubland birds in the Northeast live out their lives and how we can use that knowledge to manage their habitats. And so the questions I ask are going to be what sort of ecological strategies shrubland birds follow, and then how we can take advantage of those for management purposes. And one really useful way to think about what we might expect shrubland birds to do is to contrast shrublands with forests. Forests are the matrix habitat in the Northeast, and forest birds are very well studied. So we can think about forests and shrublands as kind of two ends of a spectrum of disturbance. So forests tend to be permanent because of the climax habitat. They tend to occur in large patches. They tend to be relatively infrequently disturbed by edges. And the extent of the habitat, of course, in the Northeast is quite high. Now, shrublands, in contrast, are essentially the opposite on every one of these measures. They tend to be short-lived. They tend to have small patches. They tend to be feature edge prominently because these small patches are usually surrounded by forest in a natural condition. And the extent of habitat, even historically when disturbance was more common, has probably always been low without human influence. And so because shrublands are really so different than forests, we can predict that shrubland birds should be doing different things than forest birds do. And the way we manage shrubland birds should be different from the way we manage forest birds. And so I'm going to go through here some predictions about what we think shrubland birds might do. And you can, if you look to the literature, you can find people saying all of these things about shrubland birds as recently as a few years ago. So first of all, we should suspect that shrubland birds will be habitat generalists, and that's because their habitats are limited, and if your habitat's limited, you don't want to be a specialist who can't find that habitat. You may as well settle for whatever's there. They should have a high dispersal rate because their patches are short-lived. They should be indifferent to edges because their patches are small and surrounded by edge. And for the same reason, they should be insensitive to patch size. So we can make these predictions about what we think shrubland birds might do. And basically what I want to do is go through each of these areas and see how the data how the data looks compared to what we predict shrubland birds should do. So let's start with talking about habitat relationships. A lot of people think of shrubland birds as habitat generalists. You could take a bird like a song sparrow, which is common in shrublands throughout the country, and you can find these guys everywhere. They're in urban areas, they're in suburbs, they're in any kind of rural shrubland habitat, they're in wetlands, they're in uplands, and so it's not surprising that people call shrubland birds generalists. So, but this isn't really evidence in itself, it's just the anecdotal data. And so we actually wanted to look at some real data and see what sort of habitat relationships we find when we go out and study shrubland birds. And so we picked two common kinds of shrubland habitats in the Northeast. On the left, you've got silvicultural opening and regenerating clearcut. These tend to be very dense with woody plants. And on the right, you've got old fields, which are managed either by mowing or birding. And these tend to be very dominated by herbaceous vegetation. So they look really different. And what we simply did was go out to a number of different sites and count birds in these habitats and see how abundances of birds differed between the two habitat types. And what we found was striking birds care. On the left, you've got chestnut-sided warbler and black and white warbler, and these are much more abundant in silvicultural openings. On the right, song sparrow and indigo bunting clearly prefer the old fields. And there's a number of other species that show the same kind of pattern. So what this is telling us is that at least at the gross level of habitat types, shrubland birds clearly evince preferences. But we can take it a little further, and we can look at successional changes. So we know after you log, succession occurs, and you get a variety of different changes in the habitat, striking changes. This is from a classic study by Aber, and these are foliage height profiles of logged area in New Hampshire, I think, over the first 20 or 30 years. And what you can see is that initially after logging, for the first few years on top there, the foliage is all near the ground. And as the canopy grows back, eventually around 20 years after logging, you get closure of the canopy and loss of the understory vegetation. It's a really striking change. We've seen some other pictures that look similar to that from here in the Northwest. And so what we wanted to know was, how do birds respond to these successional changes? Are they showing changes that match what the vegetation is doing or not? And thankfully, we didn't have to do a 20-year study. We went to the literature, and it turned out a lot of people had published data on what bird communities were doing over time after logging in eastern clearcuts. And what we found was really striking, that the birds show very strong relationships with time after logging. So the four species on the left are birds that all showed about the same pattern, and that was that they peaked immediately after logging, and they decrease thereafter. So these are birds that like their vegetation low and maybe even like a lot of bare ground in their habitat relationships. And on the right, you've got species that are showing slightly different pattern. These species were uncommon just after logging, but they increased as the foliage got taller and denser, and then decreased as the canopy began to close by 18 or 20 years after logging. So what you're seeing here again is species responding to the changes in the vegetation with successional time. So more evidence for strong habitat preferences in these birds. And the last thing I want to talk about is changes across the hydrologic gradient. So shrubland habitats in the Northeast can occur either in lowlands, like beaver ponds and meadows, and uplands. You get a variety of different habitats. And we simply went out to a bunch of different habitats and estimated abundance of birds in these different kinds across the hydrologic gradient. What we found was that in each of the red dots in this graph is a separate species. What we found is that the shrubland birds were evincing strong preferences. So the four species on the lower right, if I can get this to work, the species on the right there, the lower right, were ones that are much more abundant in wetlands than they were in uplands. And whereas you've also got a separate group of species that are on the y-axis there that are far more abundant in uplands and seem to avoid wetlands. So this is telling us that at the level of the hydrologic gradient, shrubland birds evince habitat relationships that are very strong. So what we can conclude is that shrubland birds aren't habitat generalists, rather they're specialists. And I think you can make a pretty good argument that these guys are actually more specialized than forest birds in the Northeast in their usage of habitats. All right, so the next area I want to look at is dispersal rate. Now, evolutionary ecology theory tells us that animals and plants that use early successional habitats should be fast dispersers or should be frequent dispersers because their habitat is short-lived. And if you're an animal or plant that lives in a climax habitat, you should stay put. more frequently and be a better competitor. And you can see this is exhibited by a gradient, say, from the dandelion on the left, which is a very fast, a very frequent disperser that lives in disturbed habitats, and the beech tree and its seeds on the right. These are species of late successional habitats, and they have much heavier seeds. They don't disperse as far, not really at all, actually, on their own. And so we were interested in understanding whether or not shrubland birds are following a similar strategy. Are they dandelions that disperse very frequently, or do they stay put like birds of forest tend to do after they've bred? And again, thankfully, we didn't have to go out and do the research. It turned out it had already been done. And many, many studies have gone out and banded birds and seen during the breeding season and then come back the next year and seen how many return. And so you can use those return rates as an estimate of how frequently these birds are dispersing. So we compare the return rates of birds in shrublands and forests and ask the question, are they different? Are shrubland birds doing something different? And the answer we got was no. If you look at the mean dispersal rates, the mean return rates, almost exactly the same between forest and shrublands. And while there are some differences among species, and each of the circles there represents a different species, there was no difference overall between the two groups. And what that's telling us is that shrubland birds are following similar strategies that other passerines follow. They tend to come back to places where they've bred, especially if they've bred successfully. So we conclude from this that shrubland birds actually have typical dispersal rates for passerines, and especially passerines of forest compared to passerines of forests. All right, the third area you wanted to look at is edge effects. And in forested habitats, the idea that edges are bad for birds has become very well ingrained. Birds often have reduced abundances or decreased nesting success near edges, and so management of forests often involves, as we've heard from earlier today, often involves avoiding edges. It's considered to be a bad thing. And if you go out into these fragmented landscapes where people have shown that edges are bad for forest birds, you find an interesting phenomenon, and that is that the shrubland birds tend to occur almost entirely in the edges. So this is from a classic study by Whitcomb, and he went out and mapped territories of birds in forest fragments, and they found that shrubland birds like indigo bunting and northern cardinal were found almost entirely around the edges. And that result was so common in studies of forest fragmentation that the term shrubland bird became almost synonymous with edge species. And you can find many, many papers that call shrubland birds edge species. But I think there's a very fundamental problem with calling shrubland birds edge species based on these kinds of studies. And that is that the kinds of landscapes where this research was done are usually landscapes that look like this. They have only two kinds of habitats, mature forest and some kind of open or agricultural field. And if you're a shrubland bird that needs dense understory vegetation, the only place you're going to find it in this kind of landscape is in the edges of those forest patches, because that's the only place where light penetrates to the understory to encourage the growth of the shrubby vegetation that they use. And so so the fact that shrubland birds are using edges in these habitats, I think, is an artifact of the landscapes that they're being studied in, not actually a preference for edges. And the bigger question, then, is what do shrubland birds prefer in terms of their own shrubland habitats? That is, are abundances of shrubland birds different between the center, say, of this clear cut here or the edge of the forest 100 meters back there? And so, again, we went to the literature, and it turned out a bunch of people have published studies where they've looked at abundances of shrubland birds in the centers and the edges of clear cuts. And we asked the question, are there differences? So these studies had all taken place in the eastern U.S., and we defined an edge as within 30 meters of the forest, and an interior was 60 meters into the clear cut, and we simply compared the abundances using standard meta-analysis. And the results are shown here. And on the x-axis, you've got the species, and each of those dots represents a species. And on the y-axis is the effect. And essentially, values greater than 0 indicate that the birds were more abundant in the centers of a shrubland patch, and values less than 0 mean they preferred edges. And what we found was that for the mean response for every species, all 17 species we had data for, was greater than 0. That means, on average, all 17 of these species are avoiding edges. And for 8 of the 17 species, the results were significant. And these are 95% confidence intervals on those bars there. And if they don't overlap 0, that means the bird is significantly avoiding edges. And so we take this as very strong evidence that within shrublands, shrubland birds do not like edges. They'd actually prefer to be in a larger patch or further away from an edge than adjacent to a forest edge. And so we can, again, change our hypothesized strategy to reflect the reality that shrubland birds avoid edges. And then the last thing I want to talk about is patch size. And it's also, like edge effects, it's become a truism in conservation biology that larger patches are better for plants and animals. They tend to have higher reproductive rates or higher survival rates in those kinds of patches. But there's a good reason to think that for shrubland birds, this might not be the case. And this is because of the disturbance dynamics of eastern forests. And so this is from work by Seymour and Hunter, who did some really great stuff looking at the effects of disturbance, or at the dynamics of disturbances in eastern forests. And what they found is that there's a positive relationship between the return rate of a disturbance and the size of that disturbance. So very large disturbances, such as those that might be caused by a fire or a windstorm or a hurricane, occur very infrequently. And so at the same time, the very small disturbances, like a canopy gap, occur much more frequently. And so if you go out at any one time into an eastern forest landscape, you should find that most of the patches and most of the area in the patches is very small disturbances, like canopy gaps. And so that should lead you to predict that shrubland birds should be adapted to living in very small patches, that they shouldn't actually, because they probably didn't often have large patches available, they should be okay with living in small patches. Well, again, let's go to the data and see what it says. So we were interested in comparing abundances of birds in two kinds of silvicultural openings, in clear cuts and group selection cuts. And clear cuts, in this case, we're talking about larger than 4 hectares usually. And group selection cuts, we meant less than half a hectare. And this is a really important issue, actually, for conservation of eastern shrubland birds, because clear cutting is becoming increasingly disfavored in the Northeast. We don't have a spotted owl or salmon that's actually legislatively causing us to not be able to create large clear cuts, but there's a lot of public opinion against clear cutting and a lot of concern about forest fragmentation in general. So group selection cuts are actually replacing clear cuts in many areas. So it turns out that at least 4 studies have looked at abundances of birds in group selection cuts and clear cuts, and we tallied the results, and they were very striking. In every instance where a bird preferred one habitat over the other significantly, birds were more abundant in clear cuts. And so there were a few instances in which birds had equal abundances in the two kinds of habitats, but where there was a difference, the birds always preferred the larger openings. And so this is pretty strong evidence that shrubland birds like larger patches. Another way that we've looked at the effects of opening size on shrubland birds is on powerline rights-of-way. Now, powerline rights-of-way in the Northeast are actually a really important kind of shrubland habitat, and pretty much every sort of shrubland bird you can think of will nest in powerline rights-of-way. But they vary greatly in width. And so you have some narrow ones that are only maybe 10 meters wide, whereas the widest ones are over 100 meters wide. And we went out and asked the question, do shrubland birds care about the width of a right-of-way? And given that they have... and to a certain extent, this is going to overlap with effects of edge, because rights-of-way are essentially all edge, but it's almost impossible to separate the two, really. But we went out and asked the question if shrubland birds prefer wider rights-of-way. And what we found is that, actually, this graph might look similar if anyone was probably most of us were at Matt's talk this morning. We found threshold effects for a lot of species, and many species, in almost every case, the effect was positive. Abundances were higher in wider rights-of-way. And the threshold varied from species to species, but many species would not use the narrowest rights-of-way, again indicating that they prefer larger patches or, at the very least, are avoiding edges. So we can conclude that shrubland birds are actually area sensitive in contrast to our earlier hypothesis. So when you put this all together, what you get is a picture of a bird that really looks a lot like a forest bird or a grassland bird. They're habitat specialists. They disperse at the same rates as other kinds of birds. They avoid edges, and they're area sensitive. And this means that management of shrubland birds is probably going to follow the same prescriptions as management of forest birds and grassland birds. And so let me just go through what we're recommending to people in the Northeast to manage shrubland birds now. And the first thing, and this is a little bit different than it would be for a lot of forest birds, is that we recommended a diversity of approaches. Simply logging or simply mowing is not going to provide habitat for every bird because they have different kinds of habitat preferences. So you need a diversity of approaches that create different structured habitat to accommodate all of the species that breed in shrublands in the Northeast. Larger openings are better. And I think you can make a pretty strong argument that larger openings are not just better for shrubland birds, but also better for forest birds. And that's because of edge effects. So if you have edge effects on forests created by an opening, if you concentrate the same area of logging in a single large opening, you're going to create less edge effect, as in the left graph there, than you would if you take that same area of logging and break it up into a number of different patches, each of which has its own edge effects on the surrounding landscape. So you can make an argument that from the perspective of forest birds, that larger areas of logging are better. And I'm actually going to come back to this point in a minute. Our third recommendation is that shapes of openings be simple. This is contrary to a lot of forest management nowadays. When I see clear cuts that look like this, with that kind of retention and weird structure in there, I just want to cringe because you're creating all of this unnecessary edge for the shrubland birds, the early successional species that breed in there. And from their perspective, at least, if you can just shove all of that retention off to the side and let it be part of the surrounding matrix, you're going to be doing the shrubland birds a lot more good. And then the last thing I want to mention, and this is not really based on any data that I've shown you, and that's that partial cutting is not a panacea. When we go out and do thinning and partial cuts, you do open up the canopy and you do create some shrubland habitat, but in our experience, the birds that use, the shrubland birds that will move into these kinds of habitats are not the sensitive ones. And the area-sensitive species, the ones that avoid edges, are not going to use habitats that look like this. And at the same time, a lot of forest species are also deterred by this kind of structure and actually want the more completely closed canopy and the denser and greater basal area. So we don't think, at least in the Northeast, that partial cutting is the answer to anything, unfortunately. So that's where we stand in terms of management of shrubland birds right now. There's clearly a lot more information that we need to make really well-informed recommendations for shrubland birds in the Northeast. We need more information on their landscape ecology. We're actually working on some projects related to that. We need information on their nesting success, and I'm not going to show you any results, but we have a lot of data that suggests that shrubland birds' nesting success is decreased by edges and is lower in smaller patches, which would make them, again, very similar to forest birds in that respect. But we need more evidence along those lines. There's not very much right now. And the last thing I want to leave you with is something related to post-fledging ecology. And again, if you were here for Matt's talk, you heard a little bit about this earlier. And it turns out that for forest birds, and this is one of the neatest findings in avian ecology in the last several years, if you put radio transmitters on forest birds after the breeding season and see where they go before they migrate south for the winter, a lot of those forest birds move into early successional patches. And as Matt pointed out, that's because early successional habitats have cover from predators. They probably have a lot of food. A graduate student in our lab, Carly Chandler, went out and actually tried to quantify this. She did bird counts in forests and in two different kinds of openings. And what she found, and these are all forest breeding species here on the x-axis, she found that in almost every case, the birds were more abundant in openings than they were in forests after the breeding season. So birds are literally pouring into early successional habitats after the breeding season from the surrounding forests. But the really interesting thing from our perspective is a couple of studies that have looked at the survival rates of birds in the post-fledging period. And so Dave, my co-author, put radios on fledgling ovenbirds several years ago, and he found that you could very strongly predict the fate of those birds, whether or not they survived, based on the vegetation structure. And birds that died tended to be birds that stayed in places that had very open ground vegetation, whereas birds that lived tend to be in places that had a lot of dense understory vegetation. Okay, that's one finding. Another really interesting finding, this is from a thesis from a student at the University of Missouri a few years ago, and he found that he put radios again on fledgling wood thrushes in this case after the breeding season, and he found that survival of wood thrushes was higher in fragmented landscapes where nest success is often terrible for these birds than it was in unfragmented landscapes where nest success is often quite a bit higher. So both of these results lead us to think that there might be an effect of shrubland cover, of early successional cover, on survival rates of post-fledging birds. And if that's the case, that raises a really interesting possibility. So we can imagine two landscapes, one highly fragmented and one contiguous contiguous forest. And if in the eastern United States, the fragmented habitat would probably have low nesting success, whereas the unfragmented habitat would probably have very high nesting success for birds. Now, let's imagine that I was right about what I just said about post-fledging survival. And the evidence is definitely still out on, the jury is still out on this, but if what I'm suggesting is correct, then you might imagine that in that fragmented landscape, that the nest success or the survival of birds would be much higher, or would be higher than it would be in the unfragmented landscape. And if that's the case, that raises the possibility that the population growth rates of these two habitats might actually be the same. It might be possible that the more fragmented landscape actually has greater population growth than the unfragmented landscape. We don't know, and we're in the process of a large modeling exercise that's hopefully going to answer this question. We're actually building spatially explicit models that'll predict the survival and the nesting success of birds in fragmented and unfragmented habitats. And hopefully we'll be able to answer this question. If, say, having early successional habitat in your landscape might reduce your nesting success, but might increase your survival enough to make up for it, then you can make a case that early successional habitat is a benefit to forest wildlife. And that's never really been made before. And I think that would really change the way that forests in the Northeast are managed. And so, on that note, I'm going to wrap it up. I hope nobody cites me as a justification for your treatment here in the Pacific Northwest. I think the data from the West just aren't there yet to make these kinds of claims, but hopefully they will be someday soon. And we're really excited about this project, and I'd be happy to take your questions. Thanks.